Good afternoon. Welcome to Creation Justice Webinars. I am your co-host, the Reverend Brooks Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. Warm greetings to everyone as we have the webinar that seeks to put faith into action for the good of God's creation. As always, I am joined by the Reverend Michael Malcom, the Executive Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. Michael, this is a terrific webinar that we have today. Very timely, the right person for giving us a message at this time. And I'm interested to know how you're framing today. I think when the Biden administration began, it was for a lot of us in the climate movement, it was like, possibilities, potential, what a relief. We can breathe some air and have some hope. And yet, this is also a time in which we realize that we can't let go of our critical thinking, and we can't forget the history from which we come and the obstacles and challenges that we face today. And so, what are your thoughts as we get started today, Michael?
Yeah, Brooks, first and foremost, let me tell you that I am excited about this conversation and in particular about hearing from Mark Charles. Mark, as soon as I found out that you would be our guest, I went and started researching you because I'll be honest with you, I didn't realize who you were. And then I saw that you were actually running for president. And I said, whoa, Nelly, I got to hear this story. And so I'm excited about hearing it. And I want to first say that I want to acknowledge the land of the Choctaw and the Creek tribes who land I occupy right now. And I'm doing that not just because Mark is on the call with us, but because we are at a point where we've got to own some truth in order for us to move forward, in order for us to really correct the ills of society. We've got to own truth. And the truth is that historically, America hadn't been a good actor in all times. And so in that, we've done damage. We've got to own that. We've got to own the damage that has been done to others at our hands. We've got to own that. And in owning that, we can move forward. So I'm ready to hear what Mark has to say in us moving forward, because I believe that he's going to bring some truth. I've seen some of the videos and heard some of the talks, and I believe if you bring what you've brought to this conversation and those conversations, we will get some truth. I'll be honest with you, it may shock some ears, but it's the truth nonetheless, and we need to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that framing for today's conversation and those deep thoughts and reflections as we get started. And then now it is my honor to introduce Mark Charles. Those of you who have heard him speak in the past know, as Michael just indicated, he is a truth teller, even when it comes to words that may be contrary to popular wisdom, regardless of where one is on the political spectrum. He tells the truth about our government, he tells the truth about the history of our country, and he tells the truth about the church. Fittingly, he has co-authored a book entitled Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. For years, churches have been asking for a go-to resource on the Doctrine of Discovery, and here we have it. With his book, with his run as an independent for the presidency in 2020, with his years of public speaking, Mark Charles has developed an enthusiastic following, and it is a privilege to have him with us today. Mark, I will turn things over to you.
Well, Yate, and thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today, and I'm very honored to have an opportunity to speak to members of the environmental justice from the UCC. So thank you for this invitation. Before we begin, please let me introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinishya, Sin Bake Dene Nishlin, Dr. Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bake Dene Dasha Chedo to the Chitney Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sinbeke Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinbeke Dene. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toruchitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge that I moved to where I live today in Washington, D.C. from the Navajo Nation with my family about six years ago. And where I live now, the DC area, are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. The Piscataway are the nation that they've lived here, they've hunted here, they've farmed here and fished here, they've raised their families here and buried their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. I've had the honor of meeting some of the Piscataway. I've been welcomed to these lands by the Piscataway, and I want to honor them today as the host people of these lands. And I want to publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. If you are interested in knowing whose lands you are living on anywhere else around the nation, I'm going to share a link with you in the chat. It's for a website called native-land.ca. And from this site, you can enter in your zip code, you can enter in your address, your city, your state, and it will tell you who the nations are that are traditionally from those lands. It's not the final resource, but it's a great place to begin your research. And so I recommend this site a lot. It's a great place to begin to look at what treaties were signed, what languages were spoken, and what people are indigenous to the lands where your home sets or where your city and your state are. So you can use that resource. I need to let you know over the next half hour, I'm going to be talking with you. Not only, I was asked to give an assessment of the Biden-Harris administration regarding climate and colonialism. And before I can do that, though, I need to kind of get us all on the same page. And so I'm actually going to take about the first 15 minutes of this presentation to lay some foundational level understanding to create a common memory regarding the doctrine of discovery. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because if I were just to launch into my analysis and my assessment of the Biden-Harris administration, you would hear me and you would probably think this man is very partisan. He has a single political point of view, and he's not being very fair, and he's not being very accurate. But I want you to understand how the challenges that we often are faced with and that often are put in front of us are put in a very partisan way. But at the foundational level, where the problems actually are rooted, we have a lot of shared values as a nation, and those values are actually deeply troubling. And so over the next half hour, I'm probably going to upset quite a few of you. I'm going to speak some truths and share some history that you may not have heard before. It may make you uncomfortable. At certain times, you may want to turn off your computer. Other times, you might want to throw something at the screen. Resist both those impulses. Stay engaged, stay connected. We're going to get to a better place, but I want to make sure that we all kind of have the same framework to begin this analysis as we go through it. So I'm going to take a moment to share my screen, and then we will get started. So let me just bring this up here really quick. Okay. One of the resources I like to talk a lot about is a book written by another Native man. His name is Stephen Newcomb, and he has been a great academic and researcher into the issues of the Doctrine of Discovery, and he's raised this at multiple levels around the nation and even with the Vatican. His name is Stephen Newcomb, and his book is titled Pagans in the Promised Land. There, of course, is another book that I want to let you know about, which is called Unsettling Truths. It's the book that I wrote with my co-author, Seung-Chan Ra. He's a theology professor was at North Park Seminary in Chicago, and is actually transferring to Fuller Seminary in Southern California next year. And so he and I wrote this book, Unsettling Truths, and I'm actually going to share a link for you in the chat again, where if you would like to purchase a signed copy of this book, we have those available through the sorry, I'm getting things a little confused here. We have them available through my website. And so you can order a signed copy of Unsettling Truths, signed by both myself and Seung-Chan, from my website, which is wirelesshogan.com. And I just shared that in the chat so everyone can see that. But let me go ahead and get going through the Doctrine of Discovery. I know the UCC has dealt some with this history. And so some of this may be familiar, but I want to get us all on the same page. The Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls. Edicts of the Catholic Church. The first one was written in 1452, the last one in 1493. They say things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe, saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in a new world which was already inhabited by millions and claimed to have discovered it. The first sentence of our first chapter of our book, Unsettling Truths, begins with the statement, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can even colonize those lands, but you cannot discover them unless your worldview, your belief is that the people who are already there are not fully human. Now, we have two chapters in the book, chapters 3 and 4, that actually show how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine of discovery that literally said you can kill people who don't look like, speak like, worship like, or act like you. And that journey is a fascinating journey that is good to understand. I don't have time to go into that today. But what we need to understand is the doctrine of discovery is a white male Christian supremacist doctrine that is the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to, given itself over to the empire. Now, the challenge is this doctrine of discovery has become embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he said to the colonists that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on to say that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the founding fathers used that inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist doctrine that is based on the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. A few years later, the founding fathers wrote another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you just keep reading, just a few lines later down to Article 1, Section 2, this is the section that determines who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not covered by this document. If you read Article 1, Section 2, you will note, first of all, that it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire document, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. Second, this Article 1, Section 2 specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, in 1787, that literally left white men. And technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't think about this often enough. The purpose of the Constitution, the reason it was written, was to protect the interests of white landowning men. So we act surprised today that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. We act upset that our prisons are filled with people of color. This isn't surprising. The Constitution is working. People get angry because in 2012, the Supreme Court sides with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This opened the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This isn't surprising. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. I often tell people that if you think the Constitution was meant to be inclusive, get on a Zoom call, much like the one we're on now, with a diverse group of people, especially with women, African Americans, and Native Americans, and read the Constitution out loud. You will quickly be shocked and appalled at how incredibly white supremacist, racist, and sexist this document actually is. So the Constitution of the United States is literally a white supremacist, racist, and sexist document. Now, in 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle that land titles were based on. They ruled that discovery is what gave title to the government, by whose subject and by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. They then go on to reference the Doctrine of Discovery and state that even though natives were here first, but because we're savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land. Like a fish occupies water, a bird occupies air. And Europeans, white people, have the right of discovery to the land, therefore they have the fee title to it, and so they are the true landholders. This case in 1823 creates the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by name by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. The 2005 case, in the first footnote of the case, it references the Doctrine of Discovery when it's looking at the land title between, or the ownership of land between the city of Sherrill and the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. They actually build a very similar argument. In 1823, John Marshall stated that, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their own country was to leave the country a wilderness. In 2005, the Supreme Court argued that, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneida sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneida sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. They're making the same argument. The 2005 ruling doesn't use the word savage, but they're making the exact same argument. So in 2005, they concluded that we reject the unification theory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the US and hold that standards of federal Indian law, footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling the embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. I have a TEDx talk about this online. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. You can watch that TEDx talk. It goes more in depth into this case. But I identify this is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking, right? Because she was the liberal lion. She was the voice of dissent on an ever increasingly conservative Supreme Court. Well, the problem is when your land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. Just a few months ago in 2020, in the case McGirt versus Oklahoma, the case that on one hand, it declared that all for judicial purposes, most of eastern Oklahoma was actually reservation land. But they were very clear when they said they said that the state couldn't disestablish reservation lands, and they said the courts couldn't disestablish reservation lands, but they did say to determine whether a tribe continues to hold a reservation, there's only one place we may look, the acts of Congress. And this court long ago held that the legislature wields significant constitutional authority when it comes to tribal relations, possessing even the authority to breach its own promises and treaties. In other words, the Supreme Court reminded McGirt and the Creek people, that anytime Congress can muster the will, which is literally a quote from the case, they can disestablish reservation lands and break treaties, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. So the United States Supreme Court, to this day, is a systemically white supremacist court that has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. In the mid-1700s, our nation began expanding westward. We went past the Appalachian Mountains, we went past the Mississippi River. In the late 1700s, we had the Second Great Awakening. There was a growth of churches, a renewal of denominations. In the early 1800s, the term manifest destiny was coined. The belief that this nation had the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. In 1840, the dark states to the east are established states, and the lighter lands to the west are territories, are open land. In 1900, you'll see we completed our manifest destiny, and almost the entire continental United States was now an established state or territory of the US. During that period, the US population of majority culture, white people, ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the American Indian population plummeted from 600,000 to 237,000, and that's down from a conservative estimate of 6 million to 12 million that were here when Columbus got lost at sea. If you're comparing that math, or doing that math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide just in the 19th century alone. And if you're comparing that, that's almost twice as high as the rate of genocide in Nazi Germany. It was so bad that in 1851, Peter Berndt, the first governor of California, said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And this must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying famines broken out and we can't feed these people, nor is he saying that disease is spread and we can't heal them. He's literally saying we can't stop killing these people while we complete our manifest destiny. In 1862, our nation signed the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, and another version of the Homestead Act. This allocated land to homesteaders or settlers and the resources and land to complete the Transcontinental Railway. In 1830, we had the Indian Removal Act. 1862, the hanging of the Dakota 38. In 1863, the Long Walk for the Navajo and Mescalero Apache. In 1864, we had the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. 1879, we had the start of Indian boarding schools. And in 1890, we had the massacre at Wounded Knee. I want to point out that 3 of those events, the Long Walk, the hanging of the Dakota 38, and the Sand Creek Massacre, occurred during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. He helps us understand this with the message he gave in 1864, where he stated that 1.5 million acres were entered in upon under the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of our success. See, there were 3 major routes for the Transcontinental Railway. The first went from Omaha, Nebraska, over to San Francisco. Another went from Duluth, Minnesota, over to Seattle, Washington, and a third went through the territory of New Mexico and Arizona and came out near Los Angeles, California. Within 3.5 years of Abraham Lincoln signing the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, he has literally ethnically cleansed almost all of the native nations from the states of Minnesota, Colorado, and New Mexico, making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. Between 1839 and 1898, our Congress awards 425 medals of honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. American exceptionalism, this unifying political theme we have as a nation, I would argue, is the coping mechanism for a white supremacist nation that is in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. So in America, elections are all about greatness. Every candidate Every president affirms the mythology of American exceptionalism, which is rooted in the lie of white supremacy. I want to look at America's greatness. We like to think America's great at democracy. Well, 2 of our last 5 elections were actually won by people who lost the popular vote. In 2016, the candidate won who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. That's not a great democracy. We say we have great healthcare. Well, we have some good hospitals, but our access to those hospitals is really, really lacking. We're right at the bottom of healthcare for major countries all around the world. Again, we think we have great education. We have good schools, but access to them is very limited. And actually, when you rank our students nationally or globally, we're mid. We're about the 50th percentile of education throughout the globe. We think we're great at freedom. Dwight Eisenhower said that if you want security, go to prison. You're given food, clothing, and basic health care. Your only thing you're lacking is freedom. Well, the United States of America has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. We have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. And we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people. If you want to take away freedom from a free society, what do? You incarcerate them. We're not very good at freedom. So where are we great? Military spending. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined. Energy and resource consumption. We're 5% of the world's population. We consume 25 to 30% of the world's natural resources. Income inequality. We rate 2nd in income inequality of all nations. Mass incarceration of people of color. We are off the charts of every other nation in the world. Military bases on foreign soil. We have over 800 bases on foreign soil. France, Great Britain, and Russia have a total of about 30 to 50. See, all of our greatness is rooted in colonialism. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. America is great at colonialism. In 2016, when Donald Trump was running for office, I'm missing a slide. When he was running for office, he promised to make America great again. Not to be outdone, Hillary Clinton said America's great already. At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumped into the fray and said America's already pretty great. Cory Booker, African-American senator from New Jersey, endorsing Hillary Clinton at the DNC in 2016. In his speech, he acknowledged that our Constitution excludes women and counts Africans as 3/5. He acknowledged the Declaration of Independence calls Native savages, which was very courageous. Most politicians don't acknowledge those things at all. But he ended that section of his speech by telling the DNC that these things do not detract from America's greatness. So if we understand America's greatness as colonialism, all of this makes sense, right? Donald Trump wanted to make America colonial again. Hillary Clinton said America's already colonial. President Obama said America's colonial already. And Cory Booker said our history of enslavement, racism, sexism, white supremacy, genocide, does not detract from our colonialism at all. In 2020, Joe Biden ran saying he wanted to restore the soul of America. Well, again, our soul is colonial. This is where America is truly great. This is where we are truly head and shoulders above everybody else. And so if we're going to critique Joe Biden and the Biden-Harris administration on their colonialism, we have to understand that this is actually a bipartisan value. This is something that candidates from both sides of the aisle adhere to and hold up as this is what it means to be a good country. We can see this even in the past 5 presidents. These dates, June 26th of 1993, February 16 of 2001, January 23 of 2009, and January 29 of 2017. These are the first years of Clinton, Bush's, Obama, and Trump's administrations. And these are the dates that they first had a military bombing or military strike on foreign soil. Clinton waited all the way till June. Bush did it within the first 5 weeks of his presidency. President Obama did it within his first week of his presidency. Trump did it in the first 2 weeks of his presidency. And Joe Biden did it in his first 6 weeks of his presidency. See, when you have a military that is 10 times greater and more expensive than all of the other nations, or that is greater than the next 10 nations combined, you have to use it. This is what the American people expect. And you see, each of our 5 presidents couldn't wait more than a few weeks before they went out and took this military for a test drive. And they dropped bombs or engaged in military strikes on foreign soil. They weren't defending our people on our land. They were bombing people in other nations. So I would say Joe Biden is absolutely just as colonial as every single one of his predecessors. Tribal sovereignty, again, land titles, are based on the doctrine of discovery. Joe Biden ran. He got elected by telling us over and over and over again that he is not Donald Trump. He set a really low bar for himself. All he said is, I'm not Trump. I will reverse the policies of Trump. That was his promise over and over and over again. We see this very clearly. Actually, this was in 2020, almost a year ago. At the start of the pandemic, in March of 2020, the Mashpee Wampanoag had a reservation that was actually established by the Obama-Biden administration. And in March of 2020, while there was a proceeding going in court, the Trump administration disestablished the reservation of the Mashpee Wampanoag. They did it in the midst of a global pandemic. It was actually very unjust, and there was a large outcry about it. It was almost like kicking someone out of their apartment, evicting them while there was a hurricane going on in their city. It was a very unjust timing as well as an act. And even Joe Biden wrote an article that he published online condemning the Trump administration for disestablishing the reservation land of the Mashpee Wampanoag. In his article, he stated that he and President Obama established that reservation. And he said to them that one of the most important roles that the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship is taking land into trust on behalf of tribes. It's critical for tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Now, this may sound nice to you because you're used to having this domestic dependency relationship with Native nations. But imagine if we change the word Native nation to one of our allies. What if President Biden said to France, one of the most important roles the US government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship with France is taking land into trust on behalf of French people. This is critical for French sovereignty and self-determination. Right? That phrase is laughable, if not a declaration of war. This gives you an insight into how Joe Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, views their relationship with Native nations. They absolutely see that they still have the land title. They still have control of the land. Joe Biden is merely promising to be a better landlord. He is still acting deeply and incredibly colonial. Throughout his campaign, Biden made promise after promise after promise that and this isn't an exact quote, but this is a paraphrase. He said, when I think about global warming, I think about jobs. And he promised the American people that we could have a robust economy while we fought to save our climate. This was one of his promises, that we could have a robust economy. We could still prosper while he worked on our economy. I'm going to turn off my screen sharing now for a moment. And this is actually really challenging, right? In the last year, we've endured an incredible economic crisis, which is the pandemic. It brought the global economy to a standstill. It was a year ago, literally this week, when things began shutting down. Airports shut down, travel shut down, manufacturing shut down. We had things on a global scale were shutting down almost exactly 52 weeks ago. Now, we knew this pandemic was coming. We saw what was happening in China. We all watched as this pandemic spread throughout these cruise ships that had a confined amount of people on them. We knew what was going on. We saw what was happening, and yet we kept going as a globe, even as a nation, thinking we're going to be okay. Things are going to be fine. And then even when we did shut down, how did we cope with it? How did we get through the first few months of the shutdown? Well, we said, this is only going to be temporary. This is going to be just 6 weeks. We'll shut down schools, we'll shut down businesses, we'll work from home for 6 weeks. And by middle of April, early May, we all should be back to normal again. Definitely by summer, things will be back to normal. Now, we knew that this was a pandemic. We knew there was no vaccine, and we knew it takes 12 to 18 months to develop a vaccine. And yet our leaders were causing us to cope with this by saying this is going to be just a small disruption in our economic life and in our national life together. That's how they coped with it. We did not take this seriously at all as a nation. And our leaders, the same thing. And Joe Biden was actually no better than Donald Trump. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, they were campaigning hard and publicly without social distancing nearly until the end of March. They were not shutting down. So then when we did shut down, right, things collapsed. Literally, it took a week to 2 weeks for our entire economy to collapse. Why? Because it wasn't working in the first place, right? Yes, we had high employment, but most people were working 2 to 3 jobs. They were making minimum wage, which is around $10 an hour, a lot of places around the country, even less than others. They didn't have good health insurance. They didn't have any savings. So when the economy collapsed, it literally left all of these people out. Now, Congress made sure Wall Street was taken care of. But we were not taking this pandemic seriously, even though we saw it coming. Now, the pandemic is going to be a blip on the economic radar when we compare it to what global warming and climate change could be. And yet we continue to act like we can still prosper. Had we, a year ago, instead of thinking when we could prosper again and say, just wait 6 to 8 weeks until we'll be back to normal, how do we begin at that moment, actually begun preparing for online learning in September and October? How do we actually begin for preparing to keep things shut down and economic stimulus that was going to have to go out through an entire year until we got a vaccine? We might have been able to cope with it better. At least we would have lowered some expectations. Instead of telling people we'll be back up again in 6 weeks, we could have lowered expectations and say, yeah, this is going to be a long haul. But that's not the way we did it. And so my fear is that Joe Biden telling the American people that they can still prosper while we deal with this climate crisis means that when the crisis truly begins hitting and things begin falling apart, and Joe Biden now has to make a decision between our prosperity and our survival, he's not going to have prepared the American people to make those types of tough choices because he has been centering the economy. My father, Native man, Navajo, actually today's his 80th birthday. My father, this was almost a decade ago, was in a meeting with the Christian Reformed Church, and it was a committee for creation care. And they were sitting around the table, their first meeting, having a discussion about how the denomination can more seriously take the issue of creation care. And my father said to the people in the meeting, he said, the reason the United States of America and the American church does not know how to care for creation is because they have a doctrine of discovery. A doctrine that sets up a relationship of exploitation and profit with the natural world, the resources of the world, and other people. This is the way that we as a nation engage with these things. And so when I hear Joe Biden say he thinks about climate change and all he thinks about is jobs, and when I hear the promises of both the right and the left of, yes, we can prosper while we go through this, this just goes back to the roots of the doctrine of discovery. There's a native tribe, the Athabascan people. It's a documentary called Homelands, and it highlights several native nations and their quest to regain sovereignty and to thrive on their homelands. And they're talking with the Athabascan people, and they're talking with the leader of the Athabascan people. And their creation story, he's sharing their creation story, and he says that in their creation story, they are told that there is a piece of the caribou heart in the Athabascan and a piece of the Athabascan's heart in the caribou, creating a relationship of dependency. Every year, the caribou migrate north in the spring to calf, and they migrate south past the Athabascans in the fall to winter. And this native leader was telling people that whenever the caribou go north, no matter how hard the winter was, no matter how hungry they were, they never hunt them. They never hunt the caribou in the spring. Why? Because while they may eat better for a few years, they are actually contributing to their own demise, and they will soon run out if they kill them before they calf. Now, a lot of environmentalists and progressives on the left say, oh, that's great. They applaud that. But then he said, when they go south in the fall, we hunt them freely. We need their fur for warmth. We need their meat for food. We have a relationship with them, and we depend on them. But we need to know how to live sustainably within that dependency. The progressives get mad about that because they think you're supposed to preserve nature, not live sustainably within it. And so again, this is the challenge, is when we have this separation from our indigenous understanding, our indigenous roots, we actually think we either have to solely exploit the environment or we have to only preserve it, and we don't know how to live in harmony with it. And this is what we need to be doing better as a nation. I'll end with one last thing regarding Joe Biden and creation care, which is the nomination of Deb Haaland, an Acoma woman, Native woman from New Mexico, as his Secretary of the Interior. I am so grateful that she is nominated to be the Secretary of the Interior. And I really hope that she gets confirmed. Now, one of the challenges, I watched her confirmation hearings. And many on the right, the Republicans, labeled her as a radical. In fact, they have a hold on her nomination right now because they don't want her to get nominated, although she probably will get nominated or get confirmed, but they have a hold on her confirmation right now. And during the confirmation hearing, she was asked, because when she ran for Congress, she actually went to Standing Rock and helped support the protesters. She said clearly she was against fracking and oil needs to be kept in the ground. And she said she was against the use of fossil fuels. She made very bold statements connected with her indigenous roots during her campaign. Now, Joe Biden supports fracking and is going to continue to allow some drilling and wean us slowly off of fossil fuels. But again, his priority is the economy. And so during her confirmation hearing, she was asked by several Republicans about her radical views on fracking and on drilling our oil, the use of fossil fuels. And she was even asked in her second day about her participation at Standing Rock. Now, this would have been a great place for Deb Haaland to look at that Republican senator in the eye and say, sir, let me share something with you. You have a doctrine of discovery that sets up an exploitive relationship with the natural environment. And this protest at Standing Rock was Native nations, hundreds of Native tribes, tens of thousands of Native peoples coming together and telling our colonial hosts, our colonizers, that you cannot drink oil and water is life. We were trying to train you in a different way to think about these things. But she couldn't do that. Not because of her fear of the Republican senators, but because she had to stay in lockstep with Joe Biden, who supports fracking and the continued use of oil. So she could not use her true voice, not because of the Republicans, but because of her president, the one who nominated her. This is the challenge we're facing. Joe Biden is getting a lot of credit for creating one of the most diverse cabinets and White Houses in our nation's history. But I fear that he is doing it with a sense that, yes, there is diverse colors of skin around the table, but I fear that he will not allow those individuals to bring their unique perspectives and their passions to his office. And that's just from what I've seen these very, very passionate people refrain from saying during their confirmation hearings. And so I think we have, on one hand, we have a lot to be concerned about. On the other hand, this is exactly what we should have expected, right? Joe Biden was very clear throughout his campaign. He was going to maintain the status quo. He was going to be a nicer president than Donald Trump, but he absolutely believed in the same values. I'll just add one more value, and that's the value of racism, because we're talking about this week, we're having the trial of George Floyd and the jury selection. After George Floyd was lynched on national television for the world to see, Donald Trump came out and he banned certain chokeholds. And Joe Biden went on record and repeated this throughout his campaign, that perhaps we should just train officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Those were their solutions. Now, if you actually read our Constitution and our 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment doesn't actually abolish slavery. What it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. My campaign was one of the only campaigns advocating that we need to remove that clause from the 13th Amendment. So while Donald Trump was saying, let's ban chokeholds, and Joe Biden was saying, let's retrain officers where to shoot people, I was telling our nation that we should probably remove the white supremacy institution, the white supremacy that's been institutionalized within our Constitution, and actually take that clause out of our 13th Amendment. But neither the left nor the right want to deal with a foundational level issue. They don't want to deal with the root of the problem. They want to blame each other, but they actually use each other to maintain the status quo. And Joe Biden was quite clear about that throughout his entire campaign. He was going to return us to status quo. And the status quo, again, going back to the Constitution, is about protecting and centering who? White, landowning men. And so this is the thing we have to be used to. And when we look at that, just to drive this point home, and then we can do some Q&A. In his final State of the Union, President Obama was talking about the need for our nation to have a new politics. He was kind of addressing the divisiveness he saw during his campaign. And he quoted the Constitution. He said, "We the people." Our Constitution begins with these three simple words. Words we've come to recognize mean all the people. I heard him say that, and I said, that sounds beautiful, Mr. President, but when did we decide this? The founding fathers did not mean for we the people to mean all the people. Abraham Lincoln did not mean for we the people to mean all the people. As good as the civil rights movement was, it did not get us to we the people, meaning all the people. President Trump did not believe we the people meant all the people. We've never decided, we've never made the choice that we want to be a nation where we the people actually includes everybody. And Joe Biden loves to misquote the Declaration of Independence. He says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Again, that sounds beautiful. That's not what it says, Mr. President. It says we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. If we want to fix the problem, we first have to acknowledge the problem. We have a racist and a sexist Declaration of Independence. We have a white supremacist, racist, and sexist constitution. We have a white supremacist Supreme Court. If we want to fix these problems, we have to deal with the foundations. And neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden have any interest in addressing these things at a foundational level. We can now take some time for some Q&A if we'd like to go into that.
Thank you so much, Mark Charles. That was terrific. Thank you for giving us that history, giving us that naming of the foundational problems that we face as a nation. We've got some questions from the audience. One question is, how can we as a nation heal the wounds of colonization and the destruction of Mother Earth?
That is a very loaded question. It's a great question. I actually really recommend people look at a copy of this book. I've had to go over a lot of different things today of what we need to, of what I've tried to cover. This book goes in depth into the analysis and even into some of the solutions. Because this is with the UCC, I'm going to address that question first and foremost from a church or religious perspective. My co-author of the book, Soong-Chan Rah, before we wrote this book together, he published another book called A Prophetic Lament. And he looks at the Book of Lamentations and how the United States of America is anemic at lament. Western Christianity is anemic at lament. And I point out that it's difficult to lament when you believe in your own exceptionalism. So for the church to enter into this dialogue, our doorway to it is through the process of lament, which isn't repentance, and it's not fixing it. It's acknowledging how broken it is. When I do some work with the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and about 2.5, almost 3 years ago, I was at a conference they were hosting in Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And this was during the immigration crisis in 2018. And the Worship Institute was working on kind of addressing things through a style of proverb. And John Whibley, one of my, who runs that institute and a great friend and colleague of mine, he asked me to write out some of my prophetic message in the form of a proverb. And I want to read for you what I wrote, just because I think it's a good step for the church to take in beginning to address these things. Said, wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. Remember, my brothers and sisters, Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. When the church merely lobbies one political leader and protests the other, when for the sake of argument or political gain, the body of Christ turns a blind eye to one sin and magnifies another, we are not representing the headship of our body, who is Christ. As vile, repulsive, and urgent is the Trump administration's separation of families at our border, it's not the first time. Indian removal, the slave trade, boarding schools, lynchings, Japanese internment camps, mass incarceration, even the deportation numbers of the Obama administration. The list of ways the US government has worked to destroy the family structure of people of color throughout our history is as long as it is depressing. So let's stop pretending that President Trump is the God-ordained savior or the ultimate demise of our union. The same with President Obama or President Biden. What our nation needs is not for Democrats to be better Democrats, nor do we need Republicans to simply be better Republicans. We don't even need our nation to be more Christian. My brothers and sisters, the United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. And wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. I agree with Kenneth Kaunda, the former president of Zambia, who said, what a nation needs more than anything else is not a Christian ruler in the palace, but a Christian prophet within earshot. I'm going to share the link to that. It's on my website, and I'll share a link to that in the chat if you want to reference that.
Mark, thank you so much for this webinar. You've given us an ongoing resource that I'm already getting requests for. So I think this webinar is going to live on, and it's going to live on in the lives of churches where people get together and watch and reflect upon these words. As we close today, we always like to end with a call to action. And we're working hard to make sure that we don't just talk, but we actually do. And so tomorrow we have lined up an event to complement this webinar. It is an event that will be addressing the Biden administration, part of Greenface International Day of Action. And the Reverend Roberta Rominger will be convening a gathering of people for the purpose of taking action to oppose Line 3. The event will begin tomorrow at, I believe, 4 p.m. Eastern, and people will ground themselves in their faith values. They'll hear the latest updates about Line 3, this expansion and replacement pipeline that would run from Alberta, Canada, to the Midwest, through sacred and pristine lands, through Indigenous lands, and present so much dangers and troubles that we must act. And the time is now to call upon the Biden administration to act justly. And so they will be gathering to do that. And I will share with you the link to join that group tomorrow as they take action. And so please join them. Make this more than a thoughtful reflection and chat, but as a reason to get out there and do something to make the world a better, more just and humane place for all of God's creation. So thank you again to our audience. Thank you, Mark Charles, for this terrific presentation and all that you are doing to bring about justice in this world. And we will
one last thing before we leave.
Yes.
Okay, let me just close with one last thing. I'm going to share the link once again if you'd like to order a copy of my book, Unsettling Truths. There's signed copies from my website. But I just want to share with you one of the goals that I'm working towards is this quote used by a Native elder when talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Canada. And he said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote because I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially with race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a dominant culture that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color and every other marginalized communities that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of Indian massacres in boarding schools, of internment camps, of segregation, of mass incarceration, of families being ripped apart at our borders, and we have no common memory. And there's actually no point, if you look back in our nation's history, where you can point back to a historical point and say, we had healthy community across racial lines. It doesn't exist. We need to create a common memory. We need to acknowledge our past and find a way to move forward in a healthy way. And I think the church absolutely can be involved in that. Thank you for letting me be with you today. This has been a real pleasure to join you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mark Charles. And those of you in the audience, stay tuned. We'll be sending out an email with a link to the YouTube recording of this webinar, as well as an announcement of our next webinar next month, which will be focusing on some international concerns and perspectives in relationship to the climate crisis. So we look forward to seeing you all again in a month. Take care.